beyond this house. They're very deep.
Welcome once again to our winter lecture series with our favorite professor, Dana Breen. Just a couple housekeeping things to start off with. I know a lot of you, but I'm Richard Callaghan. I'm the library director here in Bedford. And the first thing I always want to do is thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring this program, as they sponsor almost all of our programs. So all their hard work, selling books and all book sales really pays off. So with all the things we can do. And hopefully we'll have another good book sale in April too. This series is five Sundays. The next 4 Sundays we're skipping President's Day, and the last Sunday I think will be February 25th. That's the way we've done it the last few years. It's worked out pretty well. I will introduce Dan. I know a lot of you have seen Dan before, but just to extend Dan's background, Dan is professor of in the legal studies department at Brandeis University. He has a BA from University of Wisconsin, a JD from University of Georgia, and a PhD in history from Boston College. He has lectured here since 2006. Sounds right. Yeah. On a whole number of subjects. So, which actually are, if you go to our website, they're we have a whole list of the subjects that he has done in the past. I am doing a webinar today, so people could tune in and do this. But the main thing we're actually doing that for is so we can put it up on our website. People miss this can come and watch it later. So, and I think we also had a question of how do we come up with the subject of pandemics?
Yeah, somebody
actually a member of the Friends who had suggested this, I think, last year. You want to take credit?
Yeah, sure, yeah.
You suggested it?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it was great. So I think this will work out really well.
Yeah, I was happy that was the topic suggestion. Thank you.
And make sure if you haven't seen this, coffee and tea and the delicious brownies, all kinds of good things over there provided again by the Friends, and we really appreciate that.
Yes, and I did want to say that if anybody does feel like getting up and getting a brownie and some coffee, that's okay. You won't distract them or anything. Some people are so filled with ecstasy and joy by hearing about mass die-offs. Please be my guest. Do that whenever you like. And I do want to say that I was happy to be given this topic. I've done a lot of research on diseases and their effect on history, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of those findings with you over the next few weeks. This is probably the most complicated topic here right now, the Black Death, because as I'll bring out in a little while, the consequences of Black Death, the causes of it, are all in great academic dispute. And what I'm going to share with you is as close to a consensus on this matter as we could get. But all of this is still under some discussion and controversy. So that's just a disclaimer before we can get started. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I'm on sabbatical this semester, so I haven't been in front of live people for a while, since early December. So I'm a bit rusty at the moment, but I think by the time we get to malaria, I'll be my old self. Next week, I'll put malaria. So we begin with our very first slide. And I think probably the way to introduce this topic is by way of contrast. The Black Death occurred in the middle of the 14th century. The century before that was the 13th century, and that was a century where things were more or less pretty good in Western Europe. There was a general warming of the climate at the time. Growing seasons were increasing. Many people who worked the land were increasing production, extending acreage into more marginal areas of Western Europe that had not been cultivated before. A great deal of food was being grown. In addition to rising population, and maybe partly because of it, there was a larger demand for goods and services. So people who were in all manner of pursuits in production began to do better in the 13th century. Universities were growing. There was more philosophy. This was the great age of Thomas Aquinas in the articulation of Catholic philosophy that is still going strong today. All of that had its roots in the 13th century. All was pretty good until we go to the first slide, the year 1315. And in that year, all of a sudden, for reasons we still don't quite understand, it began to rain. And it rained a lot. And the rain was so awful, so continuing, that crops, as they were being planted, typically were rotted in the ground during the spring planting season, but also in the late summer planting season. Acreage in production, as much of it as there was next to useless because so many crops were unusable, couldn't be harvested in the first place. Wine, if you were able to grow the grapes, began to acquire this nasty fuzz on the grapes, which meant that you weren't going to get decent wine out of that. And in addition to that, we go to the next slide, because there was so much rain and so little sunshine, the great salt pans along the coast of Northern Europe began to be completely unproductive because you need sun in order to heat the salt, in order to make sure that it evaporates properly to give you usable salt. And if you don't have usable salt, you can't season food, you can't preserve food, you can't make cheese. All of that was increasingly impossible with 1315. And to make matters worse, it was just the same in 1316. These were the two worst years in terms of rainfall in the last 700 years. More rainfall in those 2 years than any comparable 2-year period since the late 13th century. And the consequence was people began to die. And we don't know how many people died of starvation. It could be as much as 15% of the European population during this great famine of 1315 through 1317. If you survived it, and this is why I bring it up at the moment, chances are if you were young during the Great Famine, you would be a person with less of a positive, strong immune response to various conditions, maybe that malnutrition would leave you weakened for the rest of your life. And many people have brought up the theory, at least, that the reason so many Europeans died beginning in 1347 of the Great Plague is that their immune responses, many of them were weak to begin with because of this terrible malnutrition. And if you go to the next slide, one of the results of this in folklore, at least according to some people, is the experience that so many parents have of watching their children die, and in some cases, letting their children go into the forest to fend for themselves, maybe gathering acorns or whatever they can find because there was nothing at home to feed them. The pain, the trauma of that memory may have given rise to the folktale Hansel and Gretel, which was written down finally by various sources, most memorably by the Grimms in the 19th century. That's a matter of conjecture, at least, but to me, it seems fairly likely. So what we're dealing with by the 14th century is what may have been a weakened population going into the middle of the 14th century, and you were also dealing with a cooling climate, shorter growing seasons beginning in 1300, and the recipe was there for what could be a very serious demographic situation indeed, if something should make that worse. And of course, what made it worse was the greatest pandemic of our time, at least in the last 1,000 years, and that was the Black Death. Now, how did this happen? Well, nobody really knows for sure. This is a matter of some dispute, as we'll get back to in a little while. But what we do know is this: we got a lot in common with those people in the 14th century who began to die in such great numbers from the famine. And one of the things we have in common is that our bodies are inhabited, if we go to the next slide, which we may not be able to do because the laptop is not inhabited, but that's okay. Because it's not an essential slide, it just shows a bacterium. Now, a lot of you can probably guess the number of bacteria inhabiting the human body, but would anybody care to take a stab at it? How many bacteria at this moment are flourishing in your bodies?
Trillion?
Yeah, 39 trillion. About 39 trillion bacteria are living very contentedly in your bodies. And these are one-celled organisms, of course, the most successful of all organisms in the history of life on this planet by a wide margin are bacteria and viruses. And we've got all of them in our bodies, 39 trillion bacteria, and way more than that in terms of viruses. So as far as viruses go, we got 380 trillion viruses in our bodies. So what that means is all human bodies, our bodies, as well as those in the 14th century, are really great battlegrounds between bacteria and viruses, the latter making war on the former every moment, every second of our lives, from the day we're born until the day we die. And even afterwards, they keep it up for a while on our corpses, which is kind of a nice thought. We don't die completely. The bacteria are still there for a little while longer. Now, some of those bacteria, as you know, do good things for our bodies. Some of them do not so good things. But the upshot of it is that when you talk about the human body, our body mass, about half of that is in us. It's bacteria and viruses, and 99% of the genes that inhabit our bodies are not our genes. They're in bacteria and viruses. And that's just the fact of the matter that we all live with. And it was that way in the 14th century as well. But there's one kind of bacterium that does not naturally inhabit the human body, and that is the next bacterium we're about to show on the next slide. And that is, of course, the next slide. And that, as we're about to see, is a very special bacterium indeed, and that is Yersinia pestis, named after the man who first identified it in the late 19th century. It goes without saying that nobody in the 14th century knew anything about bacteria. Obviously, you couldn't see them. So this particular bacterium was identified by a French scientist. It's named after him, Yersinia pestis or Y. pestis. And this is one of many millions of different kinds of bacteria. And it happens to live quite naturally and quite contentedly over the course of many generations in various animals. It's not native to us, but it's native to other animals. And one of the animals is on the next slide. Oh, this is the original home of Yersinia pestis. Look how beautiful that is. That's the Tian Shan Valley of Kyrgyzstan. And we've traced Y. pestis to that area, which is where a lot of its hosts also live, conveniently enough. So to see our first host, the natural home of Y. pestis, this bacterium, we go to the next slide. And that is the great Asian gerbil. Some of you have gerbils in your life. Those are just okay gerbils. This is the great gerbil. It's about twice as large as the kind of gerbil you might have in your home. And they live in burrows in the ground all over Central Asia, including Kyrgyzstan. So Y. pestis would live in the bodies of this gerbil. And in the next slide, Y. pestis also lived in a very beautiful animal. That's the marmot, enjoying a contemplative moment here, somewhere in Central Asia. So Y. pestis could live in the marmot, in the gerbil, and also in other animals as well. And based upon what we know about modern populations, this bacterium, Y. pestis, can live for many generations in these animals without necessarily killing them. Over many thousands of years, they've developed some resistance to the worst effects of Y. pestis. And that's how Y. pestis can inhabit these bodies, just as so many bacteria inhabit our bodies. And normally there wouldn't be much of a problem until periodically what might happen is that for some reason, these animals, marmots, gerbils, also other animals as well, where Y. pestis can live, find some reason to need to leave their native homes. And for example, if they got to leave the valleys of Kyrgyzstan, what might happen is those rodents begin to live among other populations, other rodents, that over time have not had a chance to build up resistance to Y. pestis. And when that happens, you might have rodent die-offs. Now, if we go to the next slide, the reason these die-offs happen is because Y. pestis can travel. And it travels very efficiently via this animal here, and that is Xenopsina chiappis, or Xenopsila chiappis, and that's a flea. And as you know, fleas are remarkable creatures. I'll just give you some reasons to admire fleas. Not that you need it, you already do. But this particular flea, Xenopsila chiappis, can jump 150 yards. Imagine that. This flea can jump 150 yards. And your average flea can jump 2 feet in the air. So if we could jump with that kind of skill, based upon our body weight and our height, 2 feet for the flea would be something like a mile for us. That's how brilliant they are and how effective they are. And this particular flea, Xenopsila chiappis, also happens to be a fairly good home for Y. pestis, the same bacterium that lives in the rodents. And what happens typically is if you've got rodents who are accustomed to Y. pestis, or Y. pestis has lived for a long time, if they come in contact with populations of rodents that have no experience with Y. pestis, this flea, bringing in the Y. pestis from the bloodstream of its host, can very efficiently jump from dead hosts to new live hosts. And if those new live hosts have not been infected yet, then those new live hosts can die very quickly. What happens with the Xenopsila chiappis is as they drink in the Y. pestis from the bloodstream of the host, the Y. pestis congregates in the gut of Xenopsila chiappis, the flea. And Y. pestis will secrete a kind of glue-like substance which binds other Y. pestis, other bacteria, to different bacteria of Y. pestis. And the consequence is they become a glutinous mass. In Synopsula chiopus, the rat flea, as it came to be called, cannot live very long if that mass is in its gut. They can't get any nutrition. They begin to ravenously become hungry. They need to feed and feed and feed. And the more they feed, the more they regurgitate. Of course, Y. pestis into the bloodstream of its new host after jumping off from an old one that had died. And that new host will now be infected with Y. pestis. And if it doesn't have much a resistance, over time, very quickly, the new host will die. In the Synopsula chiopus, the flea's got to find a new host. They'll infect a new host, so on and so on. And what you have happened is a great die-off of rodents. And that's going to happen if the population used to it, where Y. pestis is endemic, has to leave its home and become immersed in a population of non-infected Y. pestis rodents. Those populations become infected. Now you've got die-offs. And the consequence, of course, is that if you have too many rodents dying off, maybe some of those hosts where the flea happens to have been living will give rise to a jumping off of the flea from a dead host on to human beings, where they can in fact live for a while, and where they'll do the same thing, regurgitate Y. pestis into the bloodstream of its new human host. Now we'll go to our, and of course, the next slide will depict an animal you've been waiting for. There's our rat flea, and there is an example of a host where the flea lives pretty well. Until, of course, Y. pestis is injected and the host dies, and they need to find, the flea does, new host. And that's the Asian black rat, Rattus rattus, which is native to the subcontinent, native to India, but spread many, many thousands of years ago to Western Europe and also parts of Africa. So by the time the 14th century came around, there were not only populations of black rats in Central Asia, Rattus rattus, the black rat, also lived in Europe, waiting with great uninfected populations to be infected as rodents began to leave Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia to live among uninfected black rats. And that's how the infection began to spread to them, uninfected populations. Now, why did all these rodents leave Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia, where they had long been and where Y. pestis have long lived endemically? We don't know for sure, but probably the leading theory is there was terrible drought, and many of these rodents couldn't live as they had been accustomed to living there. That's where they began to migrate, and that's how the infection began to spread from endemic populations to populations that had not been infected yet. And those populations died, and the flea had to jump and jump and jump, and more rodents, and eventually people began being infected. Rattus rattus is not what you see on your walks around Boston and Somerville. If you're like me and you normally see rats from time to time, what you see as you walk around is not Rattus rattus, it's Rattus norvegicus, the Norway rat, the brown rat. So when you see that rat, don't get angry at it. That's not the plague rat. This is the plague rat, Rattus rattus. Now here's what I wanted to point out. If you go to the next slide, this of course is Joe E. Ross and Fred Gwynn, and they starred in Car 54, Where Are You? And I bring that up because there was no academic dispute about Car 54, Where Are You? That was a show that we all know, we all agreed, was on television between 1961 and 1963. We all agreed that it was horrendously funny, and we all agreed that Fred Gwynn became a star with that show and went on to be a Herman Munster following the show. So there's no dispute about any of that. But the same is not true about the Black Death. Everything I've just said is disputed, as I've said. There are people have different theories about it, but I still think that's the best theory about how this happened. So sometime in the 1330s, rodent populations had to leave, and they began to follow the trade routes, especially Rattus rattus, which does very well living among humans, really loves human grain. There's a theory that maybe the rat flea also began to flourish on camels, which would mean they could spread pretty quickly along trade routes as time went on. But certainly Rattus rattus became a very, very effective vector. And probably it's true that when it comes to infecting human beings, the immediate responsible vector with the flea was from Rattus rattus. So now that we know that all of this is still in dispute, we can go to the next slide and we can see how this began to spread elsewhere. So from the trade routes in Central Asia, if you follow the spreading black mass here, it spreads south, it spreads to the east, and it also began to spread to the west, beginning in the late 1330s and into the 1340s. And wherever Y. pestis began to infect human beings began to die in great numbers. There was no defense against this. There was no experience with it, at least for the past 1,000 years. Nobody knew what to do. And the consequence was that literally millions of people died in China. They died in South Asia. And by the early 1340s, word began to spread to Western Europe that something was killing people. They didn't know what it was. They couldn't explain it. But rumors of mass death began to spread into the cities of Western Europe. Nobody knew if it would get there. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew how it would get there, but it did arrive. And the leading explanation, if you go to the next slide, for how it did arrive has to do with the Genoans who had a trading fort on the Crimean Peninsula by which they would trade with the Tatars, often called the Mongols, to the north. They'd been there a while, and periodically they'd gotten in very hostile circumstances with the Tatars. And the year 1347 was no exception. So late 1346, early 1347, a Mongol army began to besiege the fortress of Kaffa, now Feodorosia, on the Crimean Peninsula. And the siege went on for months. And the Genoan garrison, these Italians, began to notice that Mongols were dying in front of their walls. The Great Plague had spread to these Mongols in the Crimea, and they had to lift the siege. A lot of you have probably heard that the Mongols catapulted infected bodies from Y. pestis over the walls. We don't know if that's true. That might have been something made up over time. That would have been completely unnecessary for the spread of the plague. All you needed were rats to penetrate the garrison of Kaffa, which would have been very easy for rats to do. Y. pestis, now that it was lurking among rats, would have flourished among them. The black rat, Rhatus rhatus, doesn't live much more than a year, but in the course of a year, I think a female rat could have as many as 8 litters. With a couple dozen rats in each litter, they could proliferate. So as many of them would die from Y. pestis, there were still plenty of living hosts for Y. pestis in the rat fleet to jump onto. And any of those rats that got into Kaffa would begin to infect the garrison. And people in the garrison began to get sick. And they got sick because of the bite of Xenopsilla chiavis, the flea. None of them would have felt the bite, but as soon as the bite happened, although they couldn't see the flea, they couldn't experience it, they began to notice, tragically, after maybe about a week to 2 days of being bitten, great inflammations, sometimes bulbous, sometimes the size of an apple in extreme cases. Those came to be called buboes. They were horribly painful, almost as if you were being stabbed wherever they appeared. And associated with that would be excruciating headaches, fever, chills. It would be impossible to move after a while. You'd have to take to your bed. You'd have no choice. And after those buboes began to appear, death would often follow within a week, maybe a little bit more. Once you received this plague, came to be called bubonic plague, the chances of survival, little less than 50%. If the plague struck your lungs and you began coughing among other people, now you've got pneumotic plague that could spread through the air, through coughing. And if you got the plague that way, your chance of survival was effectively 0. You were going to die. And that's still true to this day. If you get pneumotic plague without antibiotics, it's no hope. Bubonic plague, you might live. Pneumotic plague, you wouldn't. But whatever was happening to those men in Kaffa, in the garrison, they now knew they had to get away. So the living, the healthy, and the sick all together piled on the ships. Well over a dozen ships left Crimea, began to go to the Black Sea, passing through the Straits of the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, where Constantinople was, infecting the Dardanelles along the way. And it seems very likely that wherever those ships went, beginning in Kaffa, wherever they docked on the way, black rats would have joined the crew as they always did. If you go to the next slide, the way to prevent that would be simply to have a rat guard on the ropes leading up from the wharf to the ship. These are very common in ships around the world today. They didn't have them in the 14th century. So right up the ropes, the rats would go. And men who had been infected before might be infected Who knows how many were infected in these crews by the time they got into the Aegean Sea and then into the Eastern Mediterranean? Maybe half, maybe more than half. It would have been terrifying to be on those ships and see people around you begin to die and begin to die in excruciating ways, horrible ways, inexplicable to anybody. But they had to get home. They had to get back to Italy. And so they did the best they could to make sure the ship could go, not knowing that in each one of those bodies, wherever white pestis went, white blood cells would do what they were supposed to do, go to the point of infection, go to near where the buboes would eventually form, and try to kill this new toxin that had entered the body through white pestis. The white blood cells did their best, but the membrane of the white pestis bacterium is resistant to white blood cells. So instead of killing them, white pestis was allowed to spread into the lymphatic system, by which would go throughout the body. And this was happening to infected people on all of those ships. What they were becoming were no longer sailors, no longer people. They were becoming effectively plague tissue, simple reservoirs for the plague. And there was little hope for them. Antibiotics will kill all of this. Nothing may have would. And so by the time they got to Messina, probably most of the people on those ships were sick or dead. Some got off the ships. Very quickly, people in Messina, in Sicily, and the other Italian ports where the ships would went, knew that they had to keep people on the ships. But they could never do that with 100% accuracy. People left the ships, rats left the ships, and the consequence was Messina was struck, the first city in Western Europe, by the terrible Black Death. And they began to die, and Messina began to empty out. And by late 1347, early 1348, cities along the Italian coast, wherever the ships would go from points east, began to die as well. Crazed dogs began to run wild on deserted streets as death struck and death came quickly. 6 stragglers from the city trying to save themselves would crawl off into the countryside. If they were already infected, they would die in the woods. If they weren't, they would hope for the best, somewhere beyond the cities where the rats were effectively congregated and where the disease spread more effectively. But going into the countryside was not foolproof. You could still die that way. The black rat, Rattus rattus, enjoys living among us. It's not like Rattus norvegicus, the brown rat. Brown rat likes to live off to the side. They like to dig little holes by human houses, live there. Rattus rattus likes being among us. And the closest the black rat was to us, the more likely the infection was going to spread. And there seemed to be no stopping it. If you go to the next slide, this is an example, imagine scene of 1348 in Italy or Sicily as people began to die in the very streets. Now, I want to read to you now an account given by a notary, somebody who would be responsible for a will, for example, taking somebody's last testament or registering a contract. And this is a notary in Messina who happened to get off one of those ships, I think while he was still healthy. And he talked about what it was like in Messina as the plague first struck. This is Gabriella de Musi. Alas, he said, our ships enter the port, but of 1,000 sailors, hardly 10 are spared. Some of us reached our homes, our kindred. Woe to us, for we cast at them the darts of death. Oh, death, cruel, bitter death. Lamenting our misery, we feared to fly, yet we dared not remain. There was no hope, there was nothing to do. And so it spread. It spread into Florence, one of the great cities of the 14th century. We think maybe 80% of the people in Florence died of the Black Death. 80%. People were living so closely together, infection was so easy there. Maybe 20% of the population survived. And in Florence, as we're about to say, we get one of the most memorable descriptions of the plague. And this comes from Agnolo di Tura, who lived in Florence in Siena, and here nearby Siena. And here it is describing the plague in Siena, where it happened to be at the time. And I, Agnolia di Tura, here it begins here. Father abandoned child, wife, husband. One brother abandoned another brother, and so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship, and they died by the hundreds, day and night. And I, Agnolia di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. What was to be done besides fleeing and hoping for the best? Very little. If you go to the next slide, speaking of Siena, where Agnolia di Tura happened to be, this is the unfinished nave of the great cathedral of Siena. That cathedral had been being built by the time the Black Death struck in 1348 for about 150 years. They were still laboring on an addition to the nave, but there were too few workmen to complete it or even go to work every day. So they stopped work on the nave. That was in 1348, and they never began to finish it. It was left almost as it was in the 14th century. If you go to Siena, you can see that. The plague didn't seem to play favorites. It killed rich and it killed poor. Among those it killed was the young princess of England, who's only 14, and she had been sent to Spain to marry, and I can't believe she would have looked forward to this, the Prince of Castile named Pedro the Cruel. So she's on her way to marry Pedro the Cruel. She lands in Bordeaux. She had an entire ship filled with her possessions, her trousseau. It's all in the ship. And they get to Bordeaux, and the rumors of the plague by then had reached England. They didn't know it had gotten to Bordeaux, but it had gotten to Bordeaux. It was all over the city. And everybody's worried enough to save the princess. She's got to go to Castile. So they took her out of Bordeaux. They put her up in the countryside. Alas, it wasn't enough. She was one of the last in the neighborhood to be infected by the plague, and she died at the age of 14. Among those who were infected happened to be Pedro the Cruel's father. I think he was Alfonso the 11th. He died of the plague. Other lords, other rulers did so too. One who did not die, if you go to the next slide, was a very special figure. That's Clement VI. He's the Pope. And remember, this is 1348 by the time the plague gets to Marseille in southern France and places like Lyon. And so it got to Avignon, and that's where the Pope happened to be. This is still the middle of the 14th century. And Clement VI did not want to get sick. A quarter of the papal court died very quickly of the bubonic plague and the pneumonic variety that sometimes followed in its wake. The way he survived was he famously sat day after day after day after day during the Great Infection in front of 2 fires. And that actually seemed to work. If you had a fire going all the time, that would probably take care of the rat fleas. Probably ratus wouldn't want to be around too much. And he did survive the plague. It would have been an uncomfortable summer in 1348. He would have been hot all the time, but he did survive. Another thing that seemed to work, although nobody knew, was to make sure that if the plague struck your city, that anybody in a household where the plague had struck ought to be kept inside and not allowed to roam around. And that it wasn't tried in many places, but it was tried for a while in Milan. And it's no accident that the death toll in Milan was much less than Siena, Florence, and Rome. Fewer died there. And it was because even in the Black Death, even in 1348, they adopted rather rudimentary quarantine techniques, and they perfected those techniques. So by 1377, which was another terrible plague outbreak, much fewer died because they actually took steps in any port, any major trading depot, to make sure that any ship approaching stayed in the port without getting ashore. And they eventually settled on 40 days. And that's how we got the word quarantine from 1377. The idea was pioneered in Milan. And the very first quarantine was Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, part of the Venetian possessions in 1377. Venice adopted it. And that would work if you were willing to do that, if you had the city measures and the bureaucracy in place to enforce it. But that was a bit of the future. This is still 1348, 1349, and none of them was going to have a chance. Among those who died, we think probably 60% of the Western European population. The numbers keep going up the more research we do. But among those who died was the semi-mythical Laura, for whom Petrarch invented the sonnet form, and he wrote his famous sonnets for Laura. We don't know exactly who Laura was, but the evidence leads to the conclusion that the main candidate for Laura did die during the Black Death. And she was a noblewoman, and so it struck rich and poor alike. But intriguingly, there was a population of people who fared better if they got bubonic plague. Nothing was going to help if you got pneumonic plague. But bubonic plague, spread by the bite of the rat flea and resulting in those buboes, would give you a better chance of survival if you happen to have a particular genetic marker that was only identified last year in 2022. So what researchers did in England was they went into burial grounds and they found pre-plague burials, they found plague burials and post-plague burials. And they found that there was a big difference. that there's a particular marker called ERAP2. And if you had both alleles of that particular marker, you were more likely to survive than those who didn't, based upon the DNA profiles of people in those burial sites. And what they found was that before 1347, maybe 40% of the population had both markers, or at least one marker. But after 1347, over 50% of the population did. It's one of the most breathtakingly quick examples of natural selection in history. And it seemed to show that that had something to do with your chances of survival. If you did get bubonic plague, your chances probably weren't much better than 50%, probably worse than 50%. But that genetic marker helped. And we know that much. But we still have a great deal of research to do. All we know is that the death toll was absolutely horrible. Now, nobody could explain it. Nobody knew about the rat flea. Nobody knew about white peasants, of course. But they had various theories. And one theory probably you've been thinking of is that right before the Black Death, 1345, just 2 years before Kaffa was struck by the rats coming from the Mongol invaders who were laying siege to the city. 1345, it happened that the planet Saturn was in the constellation of Aquarius along with Mars and Jupiter. And you're all thinking the same thing. Well, if that happens, then that probably caused the air to become deadly as Jupiter drew up evil vapors and Mars ignited them, causing noxious air to spread over the Earth. That could have been it. That was one theory. But it was one thing to have a theory what caused it. What do you do if it happens? Now, as the pestilence, and by the way, they never called it the Black Death. People didn't begin calling that for another 300 years. But they called it the Great Pestilence or the Great Death. Now, what you could do if you were struck by it and a doctor was willing to visit you, maybe you take the doctor's advice. And what the doctor might say is, well, bad air caused this, inflamed bad air. Then the thing to do is probably just go out and breathe more bad air. Maybe that will help. So they sometimes would advise you to get out of bed and go breathe in front of a latrine. So maybe that would help you a little bit. If that didn't help, and sometimes it didn't, strangely enough, what they might do is find where the buboes were, and they would lance the buboes, which would be indescribably painful, and probably would do nothing but let the infection spread. It probably would do nothing at all. They were very much concerned with trying to prevent further spread. They couldn't do much about the victims, although they tried. But in order to make sure that she wouldn't get the plague, one piece of advice was make sure you don't have any open windows so that bad air doesn't get in the first place. Probably that would do a little more good than harm, but it certainly wouldn't stop the spread. The rats would get in one way or another. And unless it was a real quarantine, probably that wasn't going to be much more effective than doing nothing. And unfortunately, medical advice at the time was probably not much better than doing nothing. And in fact, probably a lot worse than doing nothing. There wasn't much they could do. The best thing that anybody ever did, as far as I'm concerned, was Pope Clement VI burning the fires. That would seem to work. But not everybody could do that, and word didn't get around. One thing they did say, though, was that if you wanted to make sure you didn't get the plague, make sure that you didn't take a bath, because if you took baths, what that would mean is the pores in your skin would open, and that would let the bad air in, be more likely you get sick that way. So there wasn't much of a custom in taking baths frequently before the Black Death, became even less frequent taking baths frequently after the Black Death, and that wouldn't change really until the 19th century. So out of all this advice, burning fires probably was the best, but I only know one person who adopted that, Clement VI. More about him in a little while. So the next question is, what are going to be the consequences of this? Well, if you go to the next slide, one thing that a lot of people, I think, wrongly assume is that when people died of the Black Death, and tens of millions did, maybe as much as 60% of the population, all people would do is take the bodies and just toss them in a grave. They wouldn't do that if they could possibly help it. There were mass plague pits. We find them all the time. Mass plague pits all over Western Europe where the bodies would go. But they were very careful to bury the bodies as they would if they were getting decent individualized burials. And that is east to west. So the head, the feet to the east, the head facing this way towards the east. And that essentially is the way European bodies had always been buried. And that's the way they tried to do it. So you notice all these bodies are buried in the same direction. They weren't just tossed in. So there was still human decency. There was still a sense of reverence for passing, even at the height of this epidemic. They did the best they could. they couldn't always do things as well as they'd like to have done. There would get to be a point where there weren't as many people who wanted to engage in this sort of activity, burying the dead. People feared infection, of course, from dead bodies. So they'd have to pay people to come in and do this specially. And in Florence, they were called the Becchini, Becchine, I think. And these were very poor people up from the countryside, and they'd be brought in, and they were responsible for burying the dead at great risk to themselves. And a lot of people in Florence were just as afraid of the Becchini as they were of the plague, because some of them, with no police, no kind of order, everything having broken down, would feel free to engage in thievery after burying the bodies. Any way you look at it, these are horrific times to be alive in. So the next slide will show me the worst of it. So talking about how you prevent the plague and what you do about it, with no knowledge of antibiotics and no effective means at their disposal to deal with this completely unprecedented situation. There hadn't been a great plague like this since the 6th century AD, the days of Emperor Justinian, when all too many Western European Christians did was blame Jews. And you began to see that especially in 1348 and especially in France. The idea would be that if Jews were accustomed, as many Western Europeans, Christians thought they were, to needing human infant blood for the Passover ceremony, to make sure that the matzah was prepared properly. If that was the custom, if that was the belief, then it wasn't a big step from there to believing that Jews were responsible for this contagion, or that God was angry at Christians for tolerating Jews, and that's why this had happened. So one theory was Jews were poisoning the wells, and that's how the plague was spreading. Nobody was blaming the rats, they were blaming Jews. And the other theory was God is angry, and so this is happening to us, and we must punish Jews to earn God's favor. So whichever one of those you believe, the consequence was devastating for the Jewish community of Western Europe. It began in Toulouse in southern France, where Jewish neighborhoods, the customary Toulouse ghetto was burned to the ground by Christians. And it spread from there to Basel in Switzerland, where the Jews of the city in January of 1349 were all taken to an island in the Rhine. A special structure was built. The structure was burned with all the Jews in the city in it, burned to death. And it continued ultimately in Strasbourg, one of the largest cities in eastern France. And in Strasbourg, the merchant community was quick to point out that there's no plague here. The pestilence doesn't spread here. Maybe we'll escape it. But conversely, by twisted reasoning, the city fathers, and especially the bishops in Strasbourg, decided if you want to make sure the plague doesn't get here, the thing to do is kill the Jews, burn them. And so what they did was they gathered the Jews together, gave them a choice, conversion or death. Some, to save themselves and their family, chose to convert. Most didn't. Some chose to burn themselves or kill themselves rather than convert. But those who didn't do either one of those choices, if you go to the next slide, were taken to a point that is now right outside the Strasbourg Opera House, which you see there. And there, another wooden structure was burned. The Jews were gathered together, over 1,500 of them. And they could actually see the structure being built, the pyre being built in front of them where they would burn. And all of them were burned to death. And the idea was this will save us. And 2 weeks later, the plague came to Strasbourg, killed thousands of them. Clement VI, the Pope, to his eternal credit, spoke up and said, murdering Jews is senseless. They're dying like we are. And anybody with their eyes open could see that. Clement VI wasn't listened to, and all too often bishops and cardinals cooperated with this. Some who stood up for Jews happened to be merchants who were doing business with them, and sometimes princes who liked taxing their Jewish population, were afraid of losing their taxes, but too often they were drowned out. And it didn't help matters that the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles IV, announced at the height of the pandemic, the end of 1348, as it began to spread into Germany, that property left by dead Jews could be taken by anybody who showed up enough to claim it, in time to claim it. And that only added to the problem. This was the most horrible series of pogroms in Western Europe against Jews until the Holocaust, until the middle of the 20th century. And speaking of that, by a savage, horrible, tragic irony. One of the very few places in Europe that wasn't badly hit by the plague happened to be Poland. Because what happened was the plague kind of went in a cycle, like a circle. So up Italy, southern France, England, where it struck very hard. The Low Countries, Scandinavia, then into Germany. And it didn't quite miss Poland, but it didn't hit Poland very hard. So many Jews were suffering anyway in Germany. Many of them were welcomed into Poland, which was preserved from the plague. And their descendants would be there tragically 600 years later when the German army showed up. Much of the Polish population, millions, descended from people who left Germany during the plague and in other parts of the Middle Ages. That was one response. Another response, if we go to the next slide, to try to trigger some favor from God, was one of the more famous responses of the Black Death, and those were the flagellants. This happened in various ways in various parts of Western Europe. But if you wanted to be a flagellant, one common thing to do was to ritually flail yourself for 33 1/3 days, approximating the lifetime of Christ, 33 1/3 days. And the way it would work is for 33 1/3 days, you would follow a leader, somebody who would gather you together, town after town after town, and wherever you stop, you would strip like these men so that your chest and back were bare. And the first thing you do when you got to the town is kneel, begin flailing yourself. And then at some point, and sometimes there'd be hundreds of them in one group, you'd all spread eagle on the ground. And one person at the end of the line would start whipping the people all down the line. Then that person would stop, and the next person would whip the next people down the line. And eventually you'd all be whipped about the same number of times as you were spreading on the ground. And either before this happened or after it happened, from town to town to town, where you would get there, the leader, the person who was orchestrating this, would read a letter that had supposedly come from God in 1345 to instruct the people around who were watching why this was happening. A letter in which God had said that medieval men and women were going to have to be punished. In the text of the letter said, "Your hands above your heads uplift, that God the plague may from us shift. Raise up your arms, that God's mercy on us fall." Maybe by this kind of pain, God's anger would be assuaged and the plague would stop. And this was disastrous, of course. Wherever the flagellants went, they spread the infection. Rats were very effective in following human populations, and this was no exception. And wherever they would go, anti-Semitic acts would also go along with them. And the result is there's no silver lining here at all. The result was death on an unprecedented, horrific scale for which there was no precedent and no effective treatment. And for many people, it was the end of the world. Many people decided, why bother observing the old rules? Many people gave themselves over to drinking and carousing, do whatever they wanted to. Others heroically stayed with the sick, cared for them. It depended upon who you were, depended where you were, but whatever the case was, it was completely beyond their experience. And finally, it ended. It played itself out, as these pandemics ultimately do, by the beginning of 1351. And here's where the silver lining is. So after all this death and all this destruction, if we go to the next slide, what happened, and here I'm making use of recent research by a historian named James Bailiff, who's written a book about the effects of the plague. What happened was that literally there were fewer people. And his estimate, he's one of those who estimated a 60% fatality rate during the Black Death. So what's going to happen if 60% of the population is gone? In the short term, there's not going to be much production, not much demand. That's going to be true for a few years. But after that, according to Bailiff, what happened was this phenomenon where production did go down. It had to go down. There's so much fewer people, but it didn't go down proportionally to numbers. So what that meant was more people had more of what's left over. More people had more resources than they had before, because production wasn't commensurate with death. Death was actually not outpaced by lots of production, which meant there was more stuff to go around, for fewer people. And the result was wages went up. And the average laborer will be working on an estate who is accustomed to giving goods and services as part of the rent, especially services for which they wouldn't be paid. Now we're in a position to expect payment. Now they were in a better bargaining position. And in addition, the land they were farming would be better, more productive, because all that marginal land, the land that wasn't so good, that was put into cultivation during the Great Warming of the 13th century, now they could let that go for a while, and they could concentrate on the better land. And they had more land for pasturage, more sheep, more cattle, and that meant more beef, more cheese, more milk, more fertilizer. Land became more productive, so that if you were around 20 years after the Black Death, you could look around you and more people had more than their fathers and grandparents did. And the consequence was this to me: there is now, and Bailiff believes this as well, a real emphasis on labor-saving devices. Because if you were an employer or a lord, now you needed cash to pay for things that otherwise you might be expected as a service that was just part of your manorial dues, part of the feudal system. So where are you going to get the cash to pay for things? And how are you going to make a go of it? Well, one aspect was that they needed labor-saving mechanisms. And if you look at this slide over here, you may not recognize that, but that's the famous white ship. In 1120, that ship carried the heir to the English throne, Prince William Adelane. Entire crew got drunk in Normandy. They got on the ship, William was with them, they hit a rock, and they went down. The heir to the throne died. There was only one survivor. It's one of the most famous shipwrecks of the Middle Ages. And that gave rise to the Great Civil War between Matilda and Stephen. That's 1120. Now look at this. They're on the North Sea. But they've got oars. And your typical ship, even crossing the North Sea, would have oars. We're all familiar with Viking longships that usually have oars. Galleys of the Mediterranean always have oars, for example. But oars take a lot of crew. Well, if you've got fewer people, you don't really want to be paying large crews for these ships. And so there was now an emphasis on perfecting sails and sailing ships that were larger, could carry more cargo, and wouldn't need as much crew. Just natural if there were fewer people to go around. And it's those ships, to go to the next slide, great sailing ships, that in the next century, the 15th century, would eventually begin rounding the Great Bulge of West Africa, and then ultimately got into the Indian Ocean. And why would they need to do that? And to me, the answer is that if there's more demand for goods and more demand for money to pay the people making the goods, then the thing you really need more than anything else is more cash, literally more gold and silver. And where could you get more gold and silver? There was only one source that they knew about, and that was West Africa. And to get there to trade with West Africa, getting into the slave trade in the process, they needed those ships ultimately to get around the Great Bulge and into the gold areas, now Ghana, Nigeria, and places like that. And that was the beginning of the great age of European exploration. And it was that process that ultimately made Europeans the masters of much of the world, beginning especially in the 16th century. But that wouldn't happen if there hadn't been an appetite for cash to pay new salaries, cash to pay rising wages. And if you didn't need a very nimble class of capitalists to try to figure out how that was going to happen, probably these developments wouldn't have occurred when they did. And what precipitated it, what led to it, was this great die-off, this diminishing of the population. And if you go to the next slide, speaking of labor-saving devices, it's no accident that the 15th century, early 16th century, even beginning of the late 14th, you began to have new developments that made mining more efficient, to get into the ground, to produce iron, precious metals like silver that were present to some extent in Western Europe. So those were labor-saving devices as well, which you need if the population is less and you got to pay people more. So now you can produce more with less, more iron, more silver. And the more iron you can produce, the better ship fittings you would have, the more seagoing vessels you could have, and the more trade goods you would have when ultimately you arrived in the New World, as the Spanish ultimately did at the end of the 15th century. So the connection between the Black Death and what came after has everything to do with labor shortages, higher wages, and an appetite for cash occasioned by all that, which may have led ultimately to the grand developments, disastrous for some, of the 15th and 16th centuries. It certainly put a lot of pressure on the feudal system, maybe helped the beginning of the end of that, and probably helped lead to the age of exploration. So that's the silver lining. Although it depends who you were, it wasn't a silver lining for the Aztecs, that for sure. But to some it was, and there's no way they could have seen it then. And the last thing probably to be said about it is, when you talk about the Black Death, historians will look back on it and draw these kinds of connections, all of which are controversial. But what strikes one more than anything is the sheer oceanic misery of it. The loss of, imagine watching loved ones, one after one dying and nothing to do. And the guilt you would have of abandoning them if you thought that was the only way to save yourself. And there's no way to estimate that in any way that makes sense to anybody but a moral philosopher or just a thinking person. Historians stop there because that's what we all have in common, trying to imagine what that was like. Misery beyond comprehension. And then we go to malaria. Malaria is next week, and malaria really wasn't a pandemic, so I'm cheating a little bit, but I'm going to get into some really, really interesting things that happened in history because of malaria, beginning with the strangest of all colonial schemes, I think, in the human record. And that was a decision by the Scots to become a colonial power, and how malaria put an end to that. But that's all for our next week. So that's all for this week. Thank you. Now, do you have any questions? Go ahead.
I mean, I've always associated Black Death with Europe,
Oh, yeah.
and that's what you've been talking about. But there was a slide you had early on showing that it actually encompassed a great deal of the old world. And are there any sort of generalities you can say about what was going on elsewhere, like population,
Yeah, sure.
levels, that kind of thing?
One controversy is what accounts for the terrible loss of population in China, which happened at the same time. And traditionally, probably still the majority view is the bubonic plague spread the same way by trade routes to China as it did to Western Europe, was responsible for, by some estimates, a loss of 1/3 of the population of China, and maybe more. And that helped lead to the beginning of the Ming Dynasty. They're in the middle of the 14th century. There are records of the die-off, there are records of how people died. And the main results there are political, I think, more than economic. But it also spread into South Asia, killed many, many there, provided some of the dislocation that ultimately led to the growth of the Mughal Empire there, putting an end to a lot of the native states. But less of an influence on Africa. It's mostly India, China, and Western Europe. There's still some theory, though, that what killed so many people in China was plague plus something else. We're not really sure about that because we don't have the DNA evidence from China that we do from Western Europe. We know why pestis killed that many people in Western Europe. We know that because of DNA. It wasn't what some people thought, some sort of human louse. It wasn't Ebola, which was a theory a few years ago. It wasn't anything like that. We know it's why pestis. Why pestis causes all forms of the plague: bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic. So that's the culprit in Western Europe, but we're not quite as sure about China. Yes, go back there, yes.
I had always heard that one of the reasons that the Jews were blamed was because the incidence of the plague was less among the Jewish people because of their rules of cleanliness.
Well, I've heard that too. There's some anecdotal evidence of that. You might be in a community where some people would think Jews weren't suffering as much as anybody else. But the statistics that we have, the tale they tell is that any difference was minimal. That all populations were struck. And Jews were living closely together in those cities like everybody else. It would have been unusual if habits of cleanliness, although they surely help, would have provoked a significant difference in mortality. We don't think there was. Yes, how about you? Go ahead.
Why is it called the Black Death?
Oh, it's called the Black Death because Especially in the pneumonic variety. There's a noticeable discoloration of the skin. Just before you die, death happens very quickly with pneumonic plague, but that's one of the symptoms of it. Also in the bubonic variety, there can be a gangrenous look that's more black than yellow among the buboes. But the name itself, like I said, doesn't go back to the 14th century. That's why it was called black death. Yes.
You had mentioned like about where the word quarantine comes from, or
Yeah.
where the possible origin of the grim tales. And I was wondering if there's anything else from the Black Plague or the Black Death that we still live with today, any like changes in our lifestyle, our daily lives, anything in popular culture.
Well, I think probably the main thing that stuck with us is that ERAP genetic sequence. And that has stuck with us. The bad thing about that is those who have that in both alleles are more susceptible to Crohn's disease than others who don't have it. So that's the bad line to the silver line. But as far as folklore goes, the biggest result was in the short term, when you began to have a lot more lurid depictions of death in medieval art. And we're all familiar with Boydell and scenes like that around the 16th century and even before. If you go to 15th century cathedrals, often the great altar pieces will have devils and figures of death, skeletal reapers. That was much more common after 1347 than it was before. But as far as folklore that's stuck with us about the Black Death, really nothing special. No, it's mostly short-term developments in art and culture that are noticeable to art historians. But as far as the rest of us, the Renaissance was such a huge influence that a lot of it, I think, was swallowed by that, and more optimistic times after the 16th century. Yes?
Is the reservoir of the pneumonic plague the same as the reservoir of the bubonic plague? In other words, could you have pneumonic plague without bubonic plague?
Well, you could, pneumonic plague can spread from person to person without the intervention in people down the line on bubonic plague. So in other words, if you have a few people with bubonic plague, if the bubonic plague strikes the lungs, and a lot of people would die before it got that far, but if it struck the lungs, and then you start coughing and people are in close proximity, now that person has pneumonic plague and they can spread it. Without getting bubonic plague first, they can spread the pneumonic plague. Now, the reason we don't think that happened very often is that if it did happen, then conversely, the plague wouldn't have spread as fast because so many people would have died all at once that it wouldn't get to another community. That's how bad pneumonic plague is. Now, the only way it spreads, quickly as it did, it spread like 1 mile a day at a site, sometimes a bit more quickly, would probably bubonic plague following the trade routes, and especially up the rivers. And we know, as far as rats go and people living among rats, 1 mile a day spread wouldn't be surprising. But if it was pneumonic plague, you get to a place, now it's pneumonic plague, and everybody's just dead. And there's no way to spread it further. They're gone. So that's why we think most of the death was bubonic, with pneumonic making it worse in this or that community, but not accounting for the great spread. One other question? Yeah.
Yeah. One of the most intriguing programs of Secrets of the Dead several years ago offered an alternative theory of bubonic plague.
Mhm.
And it was that it was because of volcanic eruptions
Mhm.
that there was a volcanic explosion in like 1250 or something.
There was.
Which preceded the 1340. And the theory was it had clouded out the atmosphere so much, lowered the temperature, and it brought upon a mini ice age. And get ready for this line of reasoning, that the temperature caused the congealing of the blood in the tick more readily inside. And so the tick couldn't regurgitate, as you pointed out, was one of the triggering things for the spread of the disease.
Mhm.
And that was one of the reasons. Now, in support of that theory, the plague of Justinian also was preceded by a volcanic
That's
eruption.
true. Yeah.
So your theory, is this all BS or is it a viable theory?
Well, I think the plague of Justinian very likely did have a lot to do with famous volcanic eruption. Was it Tambora? Was that the?
I'm not sure.
In the 6th century. But the eruption you're talking about that I'm familiar with happened in 1258.
Yeah,
And that did cause a terrible dying time, caused a terrible famine in Western Europe as well as elsewhere in Eurasia. But that's 1258, that's 80 years before people began to die of the Black Death. So I've always thought that although the climate did cool, began to cool around 1300, that probably meant that people were eating as well and might have been more susceptible. But it wouldn't be related directly to anything going on in Xenopsilla giallis. That's at least the way I think. But yes,
I recently heard a theory about why the plague spread so quickly, and it had to do with, a fear of witchcraft, and people would kill black cats. And because they would kill black cats weren't eating the rats, and therefore the rats were able to get around. The more rats to go around.
I've heard that too. I don't see much evidence for that. That's a theory that makes some surface sense, but I don't think too many scholars cling to that. But one thing people do say is that we shouldn't blame Raptus ratus. And one reason we shouldn't blame them for being the primary vector of the plague is that nobody in the 14th century reported a mass rat diet. So if the rat flea is killing rats and then having to go from dead rats to people, which is how bubonic plague is going to spread, what do you expect to see? An awful lot of dead rats? What do people comment on that? And the answer to that is probably that they wouldn't bother commenting on it. Raptus ratus lives among us. I don't think you'd notice dead rats around too much. And probably that they would have seen nothing they weren't used to seeing. They wouldn't see black rats a lot. They're good at concealing themselves, so they wouldn't see dead black rats a lot. So James Balick at least think that theory that we can't blame Raptus ratus probably doesn't hold a lot of water. But that's in dispute. That's something else that people argue about. By the way, the Norway rat, our friend who we see like Boston Common, you'll see the Norway rat walking around. You should thank them because the rat fleas can live on the Norway rat, but not very well because their fur is much thicker. So they can't fight into the bloodstream as effectively. So they really like Norway rat. They'll do it if they have to, but they don't really like Norway rats. They like Raptus ratus. So the more the Norway rat spread in Europe, which they did, the more the black rat was kicked out. The Norway rats hate black rats. They don't get along. So the Raptus ratus began to go out, Norway rats began to come in, and maybe that's one reason why, although plague epidemics would recur until the early 18th century, never after 1718. That was the last one. And we haven't had a plague epidemic in Western Europe since. Had them elsewhere. The plague is in Madagascar, for example, but we have antibiotics now, and that's just pneumonic plague that will save you. Yes, go ahead.
I might be remembering them. Are there reservoirs of white pests in southwestern US
Mhm.
in the groundhog population? Or is it?
Repeat your question, please. So the reservoirs of white pestis existing now in the Southwest, I think I did see something about that. But I can't vouch for the accuracy of that. We know people now and then do get plague, but that might be one reason, but now they recover. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Did they try any herbal remedies?
Well, yeah, well, what they did very often were herbal remedies. The notion that breathing bad air was probably what caused this would lead you to walk around with cloves and sweet smelling herbs, apples, something like that would smell nice. And maybe that was one way that you could prevent it. So you've all seen the plague doctor image where somebody's got this really long nose. That's the plague doctor. So the reason the long nose is there is because you want to keep out the bad smells and just concentrate on the nice aromatic smell that you've got closer to your nose. Yes, go ahead.
I'm thinking of the nursery rhyme, you bring around the rosy. And in my mind, it had something to do with the plague.
Yeah, it doesn't date from the Black Death. It dates from later plague outbreaks. But the idea was if you had a pocket full of something that smelled nice, you could always pull it right out and smell it as you walked around, and that way maybe you wouldn't get the bad air.
So how did that become a nursery rhyme? I mean, that was like, little kids would repeat this.
Yeah,
Was it more like a prayer or a mantra too?
oh, I don't know how it would have spread and how it would have been experienced. I just know it as a record of a practice that people would resort to if they wanted to try against all odds to stop from being sick. A pocket full of post. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I always heard about that, verse,
Yeah,
and that the, ring around the rosy was the mark from, you know, the.
oh, yeah,
X-Men.
right, right.
And then, but the posies were for the people that went in to bury the dead. And they would put the, sweet smelling, flowers to go into a dead body.
Well, you want it, yeah, as often as you possibly could, but probably especially that, sure. Yeah, that's right, the ring around the rosy, did have to do with the inflammation around the bubo, that's right.
Anything to do, you know, and then it goes on to hopscotch, we
Yeah.
all fall
All
down.
down.
We all die.
Yeah.
Yes, we all die.
Mhm. Yeah,
Cheery.
yes, sure. But I promise, malaria, you're really gonna like that. Yeah, so I hope to see a lot of you back for that. Go ahead, yes.
I'm wondering what February, have you decided which those three are gonna be?
Oh, yeah, we're gonna have cholera, and we're gonna have yellow fever, and the great influenza pandemic of 1919, which killed more people than the Black Death. So I call the Black Death the greatest pandemic of all time because of the percentage of population was the worst. But in terms of raw numbers, the Great Flu killed more people.
Well, thank you.
All right. As always.
I think why.